Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast where we talk about AI and video analytics with people from academia and the industry, really industry leaders, to talk about interesting topics. Today, I'm super happy to have Matthias Uhl with me. Matthias is a professor for societal implications and ethical aspects of artificial intelligence at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany. So, welcome, Matthias. Thank you for joining.
Hey, happy to be here.
This is really interesting because it goes into an area that's a little bit adjacent to what we usually talk about. Usually, we have guests that are very deep into AI, the technology, but we haven't had so many people really talk about the implications and the ethical aspects, or maybe the philosophy around it. So that's why I find it super interesting to have this conversation. So we might be a little bit less technical today. Let's see. But it's even more important to see how all of this, what we are doing every day, impacts society. So, Matthias, maybe to start us off, can you give us a little bit of a background, where you are coming from, and how did you get
Mm,
to where you are today?
Yeah, so I studied economics and did my PhD in experimental economics. So basically, the idea was to use social scientific methods, mainly experimental methods, to study more how people actually behave, as opposed to like the standard models of rational decision making that we have in econ. And then I was working on issues of consumer sovereignty, paternalism, and ways to justify like interventions into people's autonomy. And this somewhat led me into more philosophical terrain. So at some point you just realize that ultimately it's all a philosophical question. So that's where I got more interested in questions of philosophy more generally and ethics in particular. And yeah,
And
somewhat slipped into that
uh,
field.
just a follow-up question on this, on the economical side, when you did actual studies of people's behavior, what were the results? Was it different than what the models predicted?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit ambivalent because sometimes like we have the tendency to draw too many, I think, normative uh, suggestions from what we find in the laboratory without like having sufficiently replicated our findings. So one problem in this kind of research is that sometimes like you observe or you think that you observe some biases in people's behavior and the threat is always like that you're a bit too prematurely sticking this bias on people and then justify all sorts
Hmm.
of interventions because you say like people are not really rational and they deviate like from the standard models of the rational decision maker, and this is why, for instance, we as a state should help people to overcome these biases. And of course, I mean, there are these rather robust findings, like where we can say with some sort of confidence, like that people are actually deviating from these models. But my feeling is that sometimes, like we are overshooting a little bit, and should be very careful in inferring too much from two or three experiments that we've conducted.
Hmm. Okay. I find it very interesting because another guest we had on the podcast was Marie. She's a professor for sociology and criminology in Amsterdam. And it's not exactly the same, but what she's doing, she's using AI to measure how people behave in public spaces, how they interact, and so on. And it turns out that very often they behave very differently than in laboratory in lab studies. So in the sociological field, apparently lots of things are really changing right now because suddenly you can measure what people are actually doing, and it's different to what you predicted.
Right,
Sounds
right.
sounds similar.
Yeah. I mean, there is a certain fragility when it comes to the experiment. So what you often realize is when you do an experiment, what we say one shot, so you do it only once in the laboratory and you observe a certain phenomenon. But if you let people, for instance, play it repeatedly and they get more used to the
Hmm.
setting, then, like very often their behavior converges to what you would also observe in the field, for instance. So
Oh,
you have to be
okay,
very
interesting.
careful with the methods.
Okay, interesting. So, okay, so after economy, you drifted into philosophy and ethics, and today you're basically doing ethics, but you're situated in the IT department, right?
Yes.
This
Yeah,
is kind of unusual. How did that work out?
Yeah. So So after my PhD, I went to the Technical University of Munich, where I was first working in business ethics, so which was like much more related to what I originally did. But then at some point, like at TUM, I got engaged in a project on automated driving. And this led me to study, like people's attitudes toward, well, automated cars and algorithm aversion more broadly. So what would cause algorithm aversion? So why would people reject the use of machines, of autonomous systems? Are there some, like patterns in their behavior that would predict this? And and then there was a call by the Bavarian state government on a junior research group on issues of, well, digitization, and I reckoned that most people, so that was a Bavarian call, and I reckoned that most people would apply with a technological project, obviously. So I thought it could be a good idea um, to basically apply with a more philosophically, socially oriented project, and that turned out well. So I was then heading a research group on the ethics of digitization at TUM, which I then migrated to the Technische Hochschule Ingolstadt after I got my professorship there. And and then they located me within informatics or within the computer science department. And I guess I'm the only social scientist there. In fact, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I find this thinking about autonomous driving also very interesting. I saw a talk once where basically was saying, in order to be accepted, the autonomous car doesn't have to be as good as a human, but it has to be 1,000 times better than a human for us to be acceptable. Because somehow we trust humans more than the machine. Maybe because because we know we make mistakes or so.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So today you are in the computer science department, thinking about ethics and artificial intelligence. You have any? So what are you currently working on, or what are recent projects that you have been working on?
So there are basically two broader streams of research that I'm conducting. So one would refer to what you may call questions of machine ethics. So the question of how should our autonomous systems behave? So what is the morality that they should pursue? Obviously, we have certain normative principles, like that one could employ. You could say we want a utilitarian machine, like which maximizes human welfare, however construed. Or you could say we don't want that because we don't want to weigh, like lives, for instance. This is just something what we don't want. We want to insist on certain individual rights, and then one would come up with a different conceptualization of how an autonomous system should behave. And I'm very much interested in not how experts view this, but how lay people view this question. So that would be one stream of research, and the other would be more related to questions regarding the interaction between people and machines. So in machine ethics, we would rather ask which morality should we give to our machines, and in human machine ethics we would rather ask what is the morality that the machines give us as humans. So we know that they mediate our contact with reality, and very often like this affects our own choices and our own preferences. So in this sense, technology is not neutral. And of course then if one accepts this and sees certain like phenomena, empirical phenomena that we may find problematic or desirable. It really depends. Obviously, like very, very soon, questions of ethically aligned design arise. So whether we want to foster these phenomena or mitigate them by somewhat like intentionally redesigning the interface between the human and the machine. So this is another stream of research that I'm pursuing. So both are very empirically oriented in a way.
Okay, and about the first one, so what are your findings so far? Because it sounds, I don't know, trolley problem, for example.
Yes.
Like, what would the car do if it doesn't have any moral principles?
I mean, the trolley problem is obviously the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about automated cars, and what we observe. Well, not so much in my own research, but in the literature that I'm building on, is that thinking about the trolley problem when it is mediated by technology, for instance, not so much about how I would behave as a human in these situations, but how should, for instance, an autonomous vehicle behave in such a situation, people seem to tend to become more utilitarian. So they are more willing to weigh benefits and costs against each other if a machine is involved. So for instance, there is an interesting experiment that shows if you have the person standing on the bridge, and you ask, should you push the stranger down the bridge, in order to stop a trolley from running over 5 people? And when you say, should Joe do this, people are less inclined to push the person than when you say, should the robot push the person? So there seems to be a systematic difference in how people think machines should behave in these under conditions of the trolley problem, as opposed to how they themselves or a human friend should behave. And this, of course, raises the question of what this means. I mean, obviously, if you are a utilitarian, you would welcome this and you would say, well, this is great. I mean, this is what we should have, because people's ethics, in a way, becomes more rational. But if we say this is not the right way to behave, if we take a more Kantian stance and we say, well, we shouldn't push the person, then thinking, in machine mediated terms may be considered more problematic. So it depends a lot on the normative stance. So what we've been doing is we've been more looking on how people would think about environments of risk when it comes to autonomous driving, because we said, well, the trolley dilemma is great. It's a very interesting question, but it's probably not that relevant when it comes to questions of automated driving. But we say, well, any maneuver that a car makes in regular road traffic basically reallocates risks between different road users. So even if you reject the trolley problem, as many engineers do, you will have to acknowledge that, well, the automated vehicle permanently is in a kind of moral dilemma, because even if I choose safety distances between different road users, the question, for instance, will be, will this safety distances depend on how many people are in the other cars? Should I keep a larger safety distance to cars with more people in it? And this is, not only true in the trolley problem where the accident is unavoidable, but even, in a very mundane traffic maneuver where you're just, as I said, choosing the distance to this other object. So we were interested in how people think about this and how they basically want the car to behave in these more mundane situations.
I think that the car situation is also a little bit different than the trolley problem, because it directly impacts the person inside of the car. And I guess that people would also tend to like the car to protect them versus other people in traffic.
Absolutely, yeah. So you get very different results. I mean, if you say, well, assume that this is an empty car, what should it do? So if it is a purely moral choice, so to say, or whether you ask people, assume you are sitting in this vehicle, so what should it do? And some authors have identified something that they call the social dilemma of autonomous vehicles, which basically describes the phenomenon that people in principle say, many people say, I want a utilitarian car, so I want the car to save the larger group rather than the smaller group, but I wouldn't buy one because I would buy a car, that would save me at any cost, which is kind of a social dilemma.
Yeah. You have to buy an extra subscription for a car that saves you. That might not be moral. But I also find the idea interesting about the risks, because, of course, you could also think about minimizing the risks for all participants or minimizing the risks for certain participants. And risk is just another way of basically talking about statistics, right? While the trolley problem is a yes or no decision, really. But if you think about all of the traffic, then risk is, 15% chance that you will kill someone or so.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a continuous trolley problem in a way.
Yeah. Okay, so this is what you call folk intuitions, talking to people how they think about these problems.
So, yeah, I mean, there are basically two ways to think about people's judgments in these situations. So one would be the judgments that you would make when you're really detached from the situation. So, for instance, you could say, well, assume we will have autonomous cars at some point, and what should the car do? And then people, answer a hypothetical decision scenario on the computer screen, and you ask them, what should the car behave? And then obviously they're very much detached from the situation. They can sit down in their armchair, reflect, and make a very deliberate choice. And then there are, and then you would say, well, this is very often not so much based on intuitions. It's more really based on deliberation and a really well-reflected judgment, maybe. But then there are other situations in which you immerse people into the situation, right? So they have less time to think about it. The situation is maybe framed in a different way. There are maybe stakes involved, like they have certain incentives to behave in a more selfish manner, for instance, and then they may come up with a very different choice, which often systematically diverges from what they would say upon reflection. So we basically have these two modes of investigating how people think about the things, and I think both are important, obviously, because if you think about a certain policy that should be implemented, very often you are detached. So if we discuss the problem of autonomous cars in a way, I mean, that's an abstract problem, and people will vote on these issues without having been immersed very, very often. But on the other hand, we also have to really do studies where people are confronted with the technology, because then very often emotions will kick in, and certain fears, for instance, maybe that they wouldn't anticipate if they think in cold terms, so to say, about the subject matter. So and both would basically relate to what ordinary people think about the technology, their intuitions, immersed in the situations, and their intuitions when they abstractly think about the problem.
Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting approach in general because in a way, this paternalistic view also influences our intuitions based on our education. If we studied all the philosophy, then our intuitions might be different to someone who didn't study the philosophy.
Absolutely.
Or maybe at least when you're thinking it in the cold terms, not in the situation. In the situation, you're maybe more primal.
Absolutely, yeah. We call that theory absorption, yeah.
But autonomous cars, I mean, there are autonomous cars driving around San Francisco. So how do they solve this today? Do they have anything implemented there in terms of this?
Well, I mean, the thing is, that engineers, so obviously, as you say, I mean, they are driving around and they are already taking ethical decisions. The thing is, very often, of course, these decisions are taken implicitly. So the car developers basically obviously determine, the safety distances, for instance, that the driving algorithm chooses when planning the trajectory. And so this is one thing that I'm emphasizing. So we have to take these decisions. So the ethical decisions are always there to take. The only question, is whether they are implicitly made by those who now, program the system or train the car, or whether we make this more explicit by subjecting it to a societal debate. So the questions are always there. The only question is, do we decide them in explicit terms, or do we deny that the problems are there and let them just decide implicitly?
Okay. Okay, so this is the first part of your research, and the second one was the interaction between humans and artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So
I mean, this is very very topical with ChatGPT now, right? Which is an interface.
Yes. So yeah, as it happens, we conducted a study on ChatGPT a couple of months ago, where we basically confronted people with a transcript, original transcript of an answer of ChatGPT to the infamous trolley problem that we also talked about, because we were interested in whether it would influence people's judgment, and now it would be, like a deliberate judgment. And what we found is, I mean, ChatGPT is not intended to be a moral advisor. It's basically a stochastic parrot. But the question is, whether people would understand that and would reflect on that, and whether it would make a difference, whether we would tell people, you've just been confronted with the answer of a chatbot, or whether we would pretend like that it would be a human answer of a person with a coherent view of the world. And it turns out like that people are heavily influenced, even when it comes to moral choices, by the chatbot, even if we sensitize them for the fact that it is only a chatbot, and even more worryingly, you could say they don't think that the answer has influenced them. So what we can show in our study is that it's mainly a subconscious influence that the chatbot has on their moral judgment, but they think they own this judgment, and this is
Interesting.
I think that's a nice example for the effect like of a recommender system or something that is considered at least a recommender system on human behavior, because ethicists like they tend to focus very much on this point. They say, well, we shouldn't leave moral decisions to autonomous systems. The human has to remain in the loop, and it ultimately always has to be the human in control approach, which is also something that's is you can read in all the guidelines. But the problem, of course, is if the human is only nominally in control, but psychologically no longer, then you may wonder whether there is really a strong difference between directly delegating it to an autonomous system or just having the human as a puppet in the loop.
Interesting. But it sounds like it would be very important to educate people on what these things really are and where the information is coming from.
Absolutely. So this is something that we stress very much, that we got to sensitize people. So what we usually call digital literacy, that you really have to sensitize them for what the capabilities of these systems are, and what they can do and what they can't. And this is, I think, very sensitive in the normative domain, because one would assume, because people like always emphasize, well, machines can't take moral decisions, but it's very tempting for people like if they have such an advice giver to rely on it, because, well, moral decisions are tough to take, and if you can somewhat like share the responsibility with someone or something, even if it's only a machine, that helps people like to take these tough decisions. So people, well, quite literally seek for this diffusion of responsibility, and they will take anything that they can have.
Yeah, but this, of course, is also dangerous. I mean, this is what happens in wars and nuclear bombs and genocide and whatever. So it could get dangerous as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is like one of the downsides of anthropomorphizing, because that's a tendency obviously that you observe in the industry. Like that we have to increase trust, and then you tend to make the systems more human-like. You have a partner as opposed to a tool. But like obviously the moral downside is that then like it gets more likely that you consider it a team decision. Like, and then like the other part of the team takes responsibility in part, and then it doesn't really help. I mean, if philosophers insist on the fact that a machine categorically can't take this responsibility if psychologically it works.
Yeah, I would assume that if I would have a human assistant, then somehow I'm more cautious, because I somehow assume that this human also has their own agenda, while with the machine I somehow think that it's always on my side and it works for me, but it also doesn't need to be the case.
Yes, yeah, that is correct.
I recently saw a podcast with Mark Andreessen, the inventor of Netscape and a big investor and Silicon Valley guy, and he's of course very enthusiastic about AI, and he's painting a future where everybody will have an assistant or a person or a thing that has an IQ of 140, and if you are having an IQ of 120, then you will interact with something that's more intelligent and make you more intelligent. And if you are also at 140, it will be an assistant that you can interact with. So he paints this very, very positive picture where basically we raise the IQ of the human civilization, but these kind of problems will persist. So even if the AI gets better and better and better, the way we interact with it won't change so much unless we really profoundly change our view of what these things are.
Yes, I agree.
So yeah, well, it's an interesting question.
Yeah. So maybe I can like just give you another example. What we do, I mean, this is also like we are also interested in like whether people would use algorithms to instrumentalize them in order to engage in more unethical behavior. So this is something, like where the behavioral economics background that I'm having kicks in, because obviously we have a lot of research which shows how, like, for instance, decision making gets more amoral in organizations, like all these issues of fraud, like where people say, well, it was not my decision. I was just a small part of the whole system. Like whether like um, these effects, like that we have there, basically translate also to hybrid situations of hybrid decision making, where people would cooperate with machines, and like this is also what we find, that people like will instrumentalize algorithms to well take more selfish decisions, and also that when we look at the third party observers, like that then ultimately have to judge the decisions, they're even successful in doing so, right? So the other party may say, well, basically it's just like adapting the choice of the algorithm, and this way just make it easier for people and to actually engage in unethical choices. So this is of course something that we are very concerned with, and that we try to consider in our research.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very important. I'm obviously in the security industry and video surveillance and so on. And one of our issues is just the amount of data that's coming to the operators. They just have too much information to make an informed decision. It's just too much data. So, of course, there's the trend to use things like AI to simplify this and sift through the data and make it simpler. But exactly these kind of problems you have to really consider, like, because in the end, an operator just makes a decision based on the information available and that's presented to them. And of course, yeah, the psychology there is as well. So if it thinks already that the AI made a decision and they just need to basically confirm it, it's much easier than to come to this decision by themselves.
Yes.
So, I mean, today, I don't think there's any product or so using large language models like ChatGPT in the security industry. But once they are, I think those are really questions we have to consider, and we have to make sure that the human is in the loop. But what does it even mean that the human is in the loop if I'm hearing what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so human in the loop is a good segue to trustworthy AI. Trustworthy AI is a concept that's very prominent in Europe right now, but of course will be relevant globally. Can you speak a little bit to how does your research contribute to that, and what are your insights and in general your opinions on the current state of trustworthy AI?
Yeah. So, I mean, trustworthiness, how we in philosophy usually view is defined by, well, certain normative principles, and then like some. I mean, obviously, when you look into the guidelines that define or try to define what trustworthy AI is, well, you find these principles like beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, explicability. But of course, the devil's very much in the detail, because you can only start with the most, I think, uncontroversial, seemingly uncontroversial concept, which is beneficence. And that's of course sometimes a problem that you have with ethical concepts, because it sounds like a no-brainer, right? Who could be against beneficent AI? And I mean, also the Chinese would subscribe to that, and say, well, of course we need a beneficent AI. But of course, how you construe that is very dependent on the culture, and even like within Europe. So for instance, if you consider well-being, who are you talking about, right? So if you look at the UK AI Act, they specifically speak of humankind, right? And if you have AI for people, they talk of sentient beings. So that would include the animals as well, right? And this is like just one example where you can come to a very different opinion on how to prioritize certain certain things. If you talk of non-maleficence, well, we are very concerned in Europe traditionally about questions of privacy. So violations of privacy would be maleficent, while in other countries, China, for instance, they may be much less concerned about this. So what constitutes this terms? That's of course a very important question, and this is where my research kicks in. So I try to get a more profound understanding of how the people, the citizens, basically, that are then affected by a certain technology, fill these concepts with content, because the regulations always kind of run the risk of being paternalistic, because the experts or the politicians decide on how to construe these concepts.
But also, if people are living in a country for a longer time that has a certain kind of policy like China, then somehow the way people view it might also change. So like a random person on the street in China might have a different opinion than in Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is something that we know from research. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has come up with something that he calls the social intuitionist model, and that basically says that our ethics, we often pretend that an ethical judgment is based on weighing the arguments hardly, not hardly, but severely thinking about the topic, and then come up with a conclusion. And what he basically says is very often, it's based on socialization, on our spontaneous impulses, and then the ethical argument is more an ex post facto rationalization of the decision that we already spontaneously made. And this is, of course, very much contingent on the culture in which we grow up. There's no question about that.
It's like any kind of ideology we have in our heads. Even though we might want to rationalize why we believe stuff, in reality, it's basically what we learned and what we're brought up in. So I find China interesting because China also is working on AI regulation. They just recently actually loosened it a little bit, but it was surprising to see that they want to regulate AI quite a bit. But of course, with the Chinese flavor. So while they do restrict companies to infringe kind of in privacy of people, at the same time they require that AI models follow the social concept of the state of China and are not going against the ideology of the state, and you have to submit everything to the state. So it's kind of funny that some of the things they do the same way as us, but then they add this very, very Chinese component, or the current mainland China policy to it. And I guess that's very similar in all countries. Like you're saying, each country will have its own flavor of this.
Yeah, that's a great example, because it's a very different conceptualization of beneficence. And there is also another important thing that you're saying. I mean, it's of course the difference, that the different attitudes also very much that people have when it comes to the public use of AI and the private use of AI. I think there was an interesting survey a couple of years ago in the US, where you see that there is actually a majority of Americans trusting in the US government to responsibly make use of facial recognition. So they are not against that, although many experts may assume that it is a problem, but we don't have this, this resistance maybe within the population. But they are much more skeptical, when it comes to the use of these technologies with respect to private companies. And I'm not even aware of a study in Europe investigating something similar. So how are the actual attitudes of people when it comes to specific technologies and about questions of acceptable risk more broadly? So there is not much on that.
This is very interesting. I didn't know about this study, because interestingly, the actual legislation did exactly the opposite in the US. 2-3 years ago, there was this trend of regulating facial recognition. It was by state, but many states did. And what they regulated was really the use of facial recognition by the government, by police, while making it pretty liberal for companies. And at the same time, Europe somehow did the other way around, where they regulate, or they are trying to regulate companies, but always let loopholes there for the police. And it's interesting to see that actually, if you ask the people, that they say something different than what the government is doing in regulating this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a concern that I'm also having. Like, I mean, of course, it's a legitimate question. Like on how informed are people, how well do they understand the risks? But of course, it's a very paternalistic idea to basically tell people what they should consider an acceptable risk and in which domain they should do so. Right? So I think in any case, I mean, what we really need in the ethics of digitization, ethics of AI more specifically, is a more participatory approach where we are at least aware that in certain situations we are overriding the interests of people. I mean, we may still come to the conclusion that it's necessary, but we should at least be aware of this fact.
How does it work in practice? Do you have like studies where you go out and you ask people, or how could you implement it at scale?
Yeah. I mean, well, so when it comes to questions of acceptability, so what do people consider as something that is normatively desirable? What do they consider an acceptable risk? I mean, what we try to do is we conduct representative surveys. So obviously you always have to limit yourself, and you can't do it for the whole world. So what we've conducted several surveys on the German level. So, for instance, what we did recently is we were investigating people's attitudes toward care robots because we wanted to do exactly this, right? So there are many people, colleagues in philosophy, who say that's a horrible thing because we will have these machines, like taking care of the elderly, and this is, like the domain where human care is most important, or something like that. And what we realize when we do the investigations, where we specifically also ask care dependent people, so who are like already currently affected by this problem, we see that they are much more accepting of the technology because they know the realities, right? And this is what I say. I mean, the question is always, what are you comparing with? And very often, like when you detach from the subject matter, you're comparing with some sort of ideal. But when you actually know what current care is about and what the problems are, then you may come to a very different conclusion on the desirability of a technology. So that's one thing that we are doing, have a more comprehensive approach, because we say ultimately, I mean, these are the people who have to live with the technology. So one idea would be to simply ask the actually affected, but then of course a restriction is that very often we have to do this in a hypothetical manner. So we tell people, assume that you are in this situation, which people actually affected. It's much easier for them to make this assumption, right? But then you ask them hypothetically how they think about it, because we can't go to the elderly care homes, actually confront 500 people with robots and then see whether the condition improves, because very often, of course, we are also ethically limited in what we are able to do, and of course that would be a very resourceful thing to do. So when we study more direct interactions, for instance, with machines, and more direct attitudes, then we very often rely on what I call convenience samples. So very often we look at the student population at our university, and then of course also there, I mean, we run the risk of inferring, from their behavior to the general public, which is always a bit of a problem. But at least, we are trying to get a more specific understanding of how actual people will behave, instead of just reflecting on what they should do from the armchair.
And I guess, you could do this for different kinds of applications. So in the case of before of using an AI assistant, would be also interesting to hear what people would how would they perceive this, if they would rather have this AI to give them recommendations than a human, or even have AI as a friend than a human friend.
That's extremely important, because I mean, obviously, what you see here, it's similar to the privacy paradox. So very often, I mean, people reject. This is also what the Bertelsmann study finds, right? So people state that they have a rather strong aversion against machines. Maybe they think it's socially awkward, right? So I say, well, I don't like social media. You know, like I have a problem with this, I have a problem with that. But then, you know, like when you look at the actual behavior, well, not so much, right? So there certainly is a difference between what they reveal in the actual behavior and what they claim to want, and that's of course, you know, like this gap is something that is very challenging from a philosopher's perspective, because what are their true preferences, right? What they say they want,
Yeah.
or what they actually do? That's not trivial.
Yeah, and either they say they want that because they believe they're supposed to say that, or
Exactly.
they actually have a cognitive dissonance and a different view of themselves than what they actually do and are.
That's absolutely correct. So social desirability is one thing, but even, you know, like the wish to well, to retain a positive self-image, which just does not reflect your actual behavior, that's another thing.
Well, humans are difficult.
Oh, they are.
One maybe around trustworthy AI, there are efforts to help developers of AI to check if they are trustworthy, the AI. There's this Altai checklist, but basically what you're saying is that what we today have in our recommendations around trustworthy AI is very high level, and is very different if you go to the details. So how much can this kind of checklists actually help when you do AI?
I mean, they are helpful. Of course, I think checklists are always helpful, but it's just not, you know, like that we can stop with checklists, because obviously one problem that we have is if we define, and that's of course also a problem of the AI Act, right? So basically we equate trustworthiness with acceptability of risk. So basically we conflate these two terms there, but who judges the acceptability? I mean, that's ultimately the practitioners, because we say, well, they are the ones who can decide it. But whether this actually, you know, like establishes trustworthiness from the perspective of lay people is a very different question, because very often, you know, like you have to put the thing on the market to understand, you know, like whether it is in fact accepted. So I think that's very difficult, right? So trust is a very complex concept, and via this risk-based approach, I think we pretend that we go through these checklists, and then we classify, you know, like a certain technology as, you know, like acceptable or unacceptable. But of course, trust is not a binary concept, right? So it will depend a lot on the way it is implemented. It will depend a lot on, for instance, the question of whether you yourself trust in the AI Act. So there are a lot of very complex interdependencies, and but I mean, the question is, of course, what is the alternative, right? So I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we don't need the checklists. I'm just saying they don't suffice. They certainly don't suffice.
Yeah, maybe the answer is that they are necessary, but we shouldn't use them as a fig leaf of just saying if I went to the checklist, it's fine.
Yes.
But I think this will ultimately lead to a situation where the actual developers, actually the programmer doing the AI, will have to make certain judgments as well. So in the end, you encode their perceptions of the world and their social constructs in the AI, which is also very different between cultures. So if you develop it in Europe, it might encode something that's totally not fitting for China.
Absolutely. But there is one thing that I should emphasize. I mean, this is also what I try to teach in my classes, you know, like ethics. I mean, no matter what you do, I mean, there will always people who reject what you did because they just have a different normative stance toward these questions. But what ethics, of course, very often is about that as a designer or as a developer of a technology, you do ask yourself certain questions, and you make certain decisions intentionally. and not just coincidentally. And you will always reject the normative ideas of some people. So there is no consensus on these questions, but at least you've made these decisions voluntarily in the ideal case, and deliberately, and you make them explicit. So you can basically say, well, this is my understanding of autonomy, and this is the way I implement it here. And then I can say, well, I don't share this understanding, but I see that your design choices are consistent with your moral beliefs. And that's a lot already, right? So having a design that is consistent with your normative convictions. And this is why, like, in a way, checklists are useful.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, I think, because as individuals, but also as companies, in the end, we also have to define what is important to us and what we stand for, and accept that this is not necessarily objective globally. It's also a subjective choice, but it's still important to define what you're standing for. And as a company, you might define that we are standing for liberal democracies. And if people are living in a different kind of construct, they might not agree, but you still say, okay, we as a company, it's still important for us, even though not everybody might agree.
And it doesn't mean that you can't defend your arguments, right? So, I mean, of course, there are moral arguments. I mean, this is what ethics is all about. So you can justify why you've made a certain choice, but I think it's a huge benefit. I mean, if we can make this explicit, as I said, without like taking these decisions coincidentally or just randomly, because then, I mean, we can subject them to debate and we can defend them because we have thought about the arguments beforehand. Not everybody will like it, but at least we can argue about it.
Yeah, and it also gives the opportunity to go maybe in a democratic process and ask people. If you really lay it out, you can ask people what you think, this or this. And if you don't, there's nothing to judge by.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is what I mean by a participatory approach as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this is super important because all this technology will affect every one of us, and we have to involve people that are affected by this. And as you're saying, not just paternalistically define what we think is right or what philosophers 2,000 years ago might have thought is right for our AI nowadays. Okay. Well, we're running a little bit out of time. It was super interesting talking to you and about very relevant topics. Autonomous driving will affect all of us. The AI Act affects all of us. We in the security industry, we are utilizing more and more AI. I'm sure somebody will look at large language models. So we will have to make these choices that you're investigating. And I think it's very interesting work. And if there is something in the future that comes out, I'm happy to maybe have a follow-up discussion when in a year from now, AI is very different from what it is today. So, thank you for joining. And I hope to talk in the future.
Thanks, Florian. It's been a very stimulating discussion. Cheers.